Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. John LaForge about the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Mr. LaForge is co-director of Nukewatch and is the editor of Nukewatch's quarterly newsletter. He is a co-editor of Nuclear Heartland Revised, a guide to the 450 land-based missiles of the United States. You can follow his work at nukewatchinfo.org, and you can find him on Facebook under Nukewatch. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/nuclear-arsenal. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Adam.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining me. And this is such an important topic that unfortunately is too often neglected or is covered from a viewpoint that maybe does not coincide with the facts, maybe doesn't overlap with the facts just enough. So we'll get into some of that and some of the pitfalls of arguments that are made related to the U.S. nuclear arsenal in a moment. But I like to start out episodes with definitions in case someone listening doesn't know what we're talking about, or maybe they do, but they're just a little fuzzy on some of the details. So let's just start out with a very basic definition. What do we mean by the U.S. nuclear arsenal?
Well, that's the rather large number of hydrogen weapons or hydrogen bombs and missiles deployed by the United States military, the Air Force, and the Navy, deployed on submarines, large B-52 bombers, and land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles known as ICBMs. The nuclear arsenal also, interestingly, includes about 180 gravity hydrogen bombs that are deployed in Europe, the U.S. being the only nuclear weapons state in the world that deploys its nuclear warheads in other countries. The U.S. has nuclear warheads that are bombs dropped from fighter jets in Belgium, the Netherlands, Turkey, Italy, and Germany. And of course, the Europeans are quite upset about that and have been working for decades to have them all removed. There used to be thousands of these U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe. Now there are only 180 of these Cold War relics left there. And there's a pretty strong campaign all across Western Europe to have that last vestige of the Cold War removed permanently from those 5 NATO partners.
So can you get into some more details of exactly what the U.S. nuclear arsenal consists of and just how big it is?
Sure. There are about 7,300 nuclear weapons that are currently available to the military for use in nuclear war planning. Not all of them are deployed on alert status weapons. Those numbers are down to about 1,800 actual nuclear warheads. These are enormous weapons of mass destruction whose effects are well known in some circles. But, for example, the warhead on a Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile, which is the subject of the revised edition of Nuclear Heartland, is about a 335 kiloton warhead, roughly 20 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. Now that bomb, a crude and tiny nuclear weapon compared to today's, burned down 7 square miles into the city center of Hiroshima. These 300 to 335 kiloton warheads on Minuteman missiles, if everything else were equal, could incinerate about 51 square miles, that is a city the size of Chicago, and not kill 140,000 people as the 15 kiloton Hiroshima bomb did, but killed 2.8 million people, all else being equal. So these are enormous weapons that can only commit massacres, mass destruction with radiation and fire. That's why so many people around the world have been working for decades to see them abolished. It's not lawful to commit massacres. And since World War II, the planning and preparation of indiscriminate warfare has been unlawful, at least under the principles of the Nuremberg Charter established after the Nuremberg trials that followed the Second World War.
So in the United States a lot, especially from politicians, you'll hear talk that the U.S. is falling behind in terms of nuclear weapons, or that its weapons are outdated compared to other countries. So what programs are there right now focused on a quote-unquote improving the nuclear arsenal, and how does the U.S. nuclear arsenal compare to that of other countries?
Yeah, those claims that the U.S. is falling behind or somehow less of a nuclear weapons power than opponents are fatuous. They're completely fraudulent. They're promoted and promulgated by people with or congressional representatives with vested interests in maintaining large weapons contracts for their constituents, maintaining heavy campaign contributions from weapons contractors, and maintaining large redundant military bases in their states because of the income and better roads and infrastructure that comes with unnecessary military spending. In fact, the U.S. arsenal is enormous. You don't have to take my word for it. You can watch former Secretary of Defense William Perry in his recent appearance on 60 Minutes about a month and a half ago, where he said, the nuclear arsenal is still so enormous that it could burn down or destroy civilization. And that is an amount of military power that is perfectly insane. And conventional weapons that we know have the power to overtake entire countries, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan, make nuclear weapons perfectly redundant and unnecessary in a military force. And this is William Perry's argument now with his new book. He's on a speaking tour, publicizing his new book, My Journey to the Nuclear Brink. He was Secretary of Defense from 1994 to 97, and he argued just September 30th in a New York Times opinion piece that the ICBMs that our new book focuses on can be eliminated without any reduction in the military force power or defensive capability of the United States. Now, this is a great exclamation point for our book, which brings to light a lot of the scandals and accidents that have happened in the ICBM or land-based missile system, as well as other arguments for their elimination.
All right, and I want to return to some of the subjects that you brought up in your answer, including the role that the military-industrial complex and military contractors play. I want to return to that in a moment. But I want to define a couple more terms that are often brought up whenever the subject of the U.S. nuclear arsenal is brought up. The two terms are nuclear triad and then the Minuteman missiles, and in particular the Minuteman III missiles. So what is the nuclear triad and what are the Minuteman missiles?
Sure. The triad, that term is a reference to the three-part nuclear arsenal, the nuclear weapon system. Three parts are references to the platforms, so-called platforms, that are used to launch nuclear weapons. And there are three principal platforms. One, as I said earlier, are the submarines based in outside Seattle, at Bremerton, Washington, and at Kings Bay, Georgia, the giant Ohio-class Trident submarines that are 2 football fields long and which each carry 24 intercontinental submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Each of those 24 missiles can carry up to 8 warheads. So these are the most destructive weapons ever created by human beings, these Trident submarines. A second part of the three-part triad are the B-52 bombers and the B-2 stealth bombers that carry nuclear-armed cruise missiles, as well as these B-61 gravity bombs. And the third part are the Minuteman III land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are deployed at 3 major fields, as they're called, missile fields. One set of 150 of those land-based missiles is north of Denver at the confluence of Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. There's a little corner where those 3 states share a border, and the F.E. Warren Air Force Base there controls those 150 missiles. There's another 150 Minuteman III missiles in Montana near Great Falls, and the third set of 150 is almost encircling the city of Minot, North Dakota, where the Air Force has a major Air Force base. The base there controls both the land-based missiles and a fleet of B-52 nuclear-armed heavy bombers. So that's the triad: submarines, heavy bombers, and land-based missiles. The second question was, I forgot. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, it was about the Minuteman and the Minuteman III missiles in particular and what they are.
Sure. The Minuteman IIIs are the latest permutation of the Minuteman system. Started in Minuteman I. Minuteman IIs were single warhead rockets with giant warheads of 1.2 megaton warheads. Used to be atop the Minuteman II missiles, which were in Missouri, South Dakota, and also North Dakota. Those Minuteman II missiles now have all been either retired permanently or replaced with Minuteman IIIs. Minuteman III rockets, which have a range of over 5,000 miles, are set out in these three fields, as I mentioned: North Dakota, Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana, and operated by Air Force base personnel called missileers. And the missileers work underground in Launch Control Centers, or LCCs, on 3-day shifts, working 12 hours a shift, to be at the ready to carry out a presidential order to launch these giant weapons against either China or Russia or the enemy du jour, you might say. Sometimes other countries or sites are in the targets for these weapons. In Omaha, Nebraska, where the Offutt Air Force Base is located, there's a committee there called the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff, and the JSTPS picks the targets for these nuclear warheads. Currently, they are officially supposed to be targeted at the oceans, as well as Russia's rockets. The bombs supposedly targeted at the oceans as a goodwill measure. Of course, they can be retargeted to hit airfields, other weapons, and major cities on a moment's notice in the event of a crisis. But these Minuteman III then used to have 3 warheads in the 80s and the 90s. Because of START treaties and the New START agreements, they've been reduced to single warhead rockets. As I mentioned, the warheads are still enormous, 20 times the force of the Hiroshima bomb, which killed 140,000 people. So these single warhead rockets now have been called redundant, useless, and quite dangerous. In fact, by high-level officials like former Secretary of Defense Perry, a former Vice Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General James Cartwright, who says about these crazy old Cold War relics that they're, quote, too easy to launch on bad information, end quote. This is rather hair-raising, considering the potential destruction that these things portend.
All right, so I want to move on to looking at the sorts of people who are in favor of the U.S. nuclear arsenal being so big and who discuss replacing missiles and replacing aspects of the nuclear arsenal rather than downsizing the arsenal. Now, a term that you've used in the past is the ICBM coalition. So can you talk about what the ICBM coalition is and what sorts of arguments members of the ICBM coalition and others make in favor of the U.S. having such a large nuclear arsenal?
Oh, yes, great. The self-identified ICBM coalition is a group of 10 U.S. senators from Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, Louisiana, Colorado, who are adamant supporters of the nuclear weapons arsenal in general and the Minuteman system in particular, because they are representing the states where these Air Force bases operate these missiles. So they have a vested interest in maintaining all the hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars that come into their state to maintain, upgrade, and threaten the use of these weapons of mass destruction. These 10 senators work overtime with 40-year-old arguments in favor of nuclear weapons deployment, arguments that have been, completely discredited and discarded. As a matter of fact, when we first published Nuclear Heartland in 1988, there were 1,000 land-based ICBMs, the Minuteman 2s and 3s. Today, there are 450. The same argument is put forward to defend these 450 as were put forward in 1988 to defend 1,000 of them. Something is obviously untrue about the need for these weapons, because today we have less than half of what they used to be, an essential, crucial number. Obviously, the conventional forces paid for at great expense by the U.S. taxpayers, 12 aircraft carriers, the giant Army and Navy and Air Forces that don't need or use or possess nuclear weapons are capable of bombing, invading, taking over, and setting up friendly governments in whole countries without the use of nuclear weapons. So these arguments put forward by the ICBM coalition that these weapons are useful in deterring attacks on us are simply false. Of course, the USS Cole was bombed in the year 2000. The World Trade Center was bombed in 1993. The Morrow Building was attacked by Timothy McVeigh. All these attacks on the U.S. happened in spite of the fact that we had these so-called deterrents available at all times. In fact, the nuclear weapons don't deter attacks on the United States at all any longer, or its sites around the world, which happen on a regular basis. So the arguments that are put forward that these weapons are defensive, those are easily refuted too, considering the development of highly accurate nuclear warhead delivery systems now. Accuracy with nuclear weapons is only useful if you intend to strike an opponent's targets before they're launched. Nuclear weapons create such massive destruction, as I pointed out, 51 square miles per warhead, that you don't need any accuracy if these weapons are a deterrent that is intended for a response in kind if we're first attacked. You only need accuracy with nuclear weapons if you intend to destroy enemy weapons before they're launched in a first strike, a sneak attack, a Pearl Harbor sort of attack, which is exactly what deterrence is supposed to prevent. So all these arguments are completely fatuous anymore, all arguments in favor of retaining nuclear weapons. And that's why there's such a global movement to finally get rid of the last vestiges. The Soviet Union's arsenal now reduced to about the same size as ours by Russia. They're all just a fraction of what the arsenals used to be. The U.S. produced 27,000 warheads at the height of the Cold War, and today has about between 7,000 and 8,000. Same with the Soviet Union and now Russia. Other countries have such small arsenals that abolition of these archaic weapons is really just around the corner. If people could just raise the volume of demand loud enough, it wouldn't be hard to see it done. Other countries, even nuclear-armed states like France, Great Britain, India, Pakistan, Israel, would gladly eliminate their 100, 200, 300 nuclear weapons if the U.S. and Russia could finally lead the way. And there are precedents that are quite good that could be followed. In 1992, for example, George Herbert Walker Bush removed his nuclear weapons from surface ships in the Navy, unilaterally, without any treaty negotiations, without any promise of a quid pro quo from Russia, took all nuclear weapons off of surface ships like carriers and battleships and other Navy transports that carried ship-based nuclear weapons. They're only in the Navy retained now on submarines. Well, that unilateral action was responded in kind by Russia, was parallel and taken up by Russia without any treaty necessary. So that's a great example of what could be done today. Even before President Obama leaves office, William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, has recommended to him in his September 30th op-ed that the president could begin the drawdown of the land-based missiles before he leaves office. He could return from Europe the B-61s that are forward deployed in very dangerous places and reduce tensions around the world and show a really great example of diplomatic motion or movement that could be easily followed up on by our opponents around the world.
So what are some of the main problems then with having this system and with having this arsenal, and just how dangerous is it?
Well, just past July, maybe your listeners will remember that in Turkey there was a failed coup attempt that was harshly responded to by the standing government. That coup was led by military officials at the Incirlik Air Force Base. That Turkish Air Force Base is heavily used by U.S. forces in its war around the region in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's a launching pad, basically, for the U.S. The U.S. also has 50 of the B-61 gravity bombs on that Air Force base that are supposedly under the control of the U.S. forces there. We would hope that the U.S. is keeping a tight control on those 50 H-bombs because all the commanding generals and officers at that base were arrested and imprisoned after the failed coup. This is 100 miles from Syria and the raging civil war there. And 100 miles from ISIS territory, where terrorists could potentially threaten to get their hands on these U.S. weapons. In fact, the U.S. being the only country to ever have used these weapons against enemy civilians has a huge responsibility to make sure that they are ultimately done away with, as it promised to in the Non-Proliferation 22. This campaign to adhere to the Non-Proliferation Treaty is being promoted by International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN.org, ICAN.org. And these people have great information about the dangerousness of the current arsenal and the risks that it poses for accidents or unintentional launches. So I recommend people check out the background information at ICAN.org.
Okay, and of course, we'll link to that at wakeupcallpodcast.com/nuclear-arsenal, show notes page for this episode. But just a few more topics I want to touch on before we wrap up here. Earlier, we talked about the ICBM coalition and their support for the arsenal and for replacing these weapons and for not eliminating any. And we, of course, have refuted the arguments they make and outlined some of the big problems with having this arsenal. And you also pointed out that the deterrence argument is nonsense. It's entirely a fallacy. So if this isn't about a deterrence and it's not about national defense, what is this about? Is it just about the military-industrial complex and crony corporations giving politicians donations and setting up plants in key states and key congressional districts? Is that what this is about?
Yeah, that's precisely the only thing that is going on here. The Center for Responsive Politics found in 2012 that these 10 senators got $500,000 from the 4 largest missile contractors for that current election cycle. They are General Electric, Northrop Grumman, Boeing Corporation, and yes, United Technologies. These companies have a big vested interest in maintenance and upkeep and upgrading of these intercontinental. They also have an interest in producing a follow-on missile, which is actually being proposed under Obama's $1 trillion nuclear weapons complex rebuild. This is where William Perry says General James Cartwright says $100 billion could be saved if this follow-on missile is eliminated and that these current ICBMs are retired permanently. That's a serious budget waste of money, and that money is needed seriously in the U.S. for infrastructure rebuild, education, environmental protection, and healthcare. $100 billion will do a lot to protect the environment and help improve the health and well-being of children and other people in the country who need health care more than additional radiation development of thermonuclear weapons.
Right, and can you talk about the radiation that employees in these weapons facilities are exposed to, and how deadly and tragic that is, and the sorts of compensation and recourse individuals have who fall ill due to the radiation they're exposed to?
Most recently, in November of 2015, the McClatchy News Service published the results of a year-long investigation into nuclear weapons factory workers and the incidence of cancer mortality among them. And their conservative estimate was that 33,000, slightly over 33,000 U.S. weapons plant workers died from cancer that was caused by on-site radiation exposure, the exposure and inhalation of particles of other isotopes such as plutonium that are machined in the development of primary and secondary parts of hydrogen bombs.
Before we wrap up, I want to return to the whole issue of deterrence. And as problematic as that argument is, let's just say for a moment that it had some validity. Isn't it the case that even proponents of the deterrence rationale behind nuclear weapons, don't even they say that the arsenal could at least be downsized dramatically?
Oh, absolutely. Colonel Chance B. Chance Salzman wrote a report in 2012 for the Air Force that said the overall arsenal, which has over 7,000 warheads in it now, could be reduced to 311 warheads, and that would be a sufficient number of weapons to deter any attacks, or nuclear attacks anyway, on the United States. That's an enormous reduction, something that's been advocated for years by nuclear critics. And that's just one example of the numbers that could be slashed from the current arsenal. As far as deterrence goes, it's rather to be able to refute that so easily. There was an Eastern Airlines flight hijacked in 1970, the 1970 Iran hostage crisis, the Marine barracks bombing in 1983. And none of these attacks on U.S. sites or interests could have been prevented and weren't deterred by nuclear weapons. Again and again, this lesson is taught to us, and yet it's still considered the principal rationale for maintaining nuclear weapons. It's kind of like Mark Twain said, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Nuclear weapons don't deter attacks on the United States and can be done away with without any loss of security. This is coming from William Perry, Secretary of Defense for 4 years, who says that they're more dangerous than they are helpful.
Right, and that's an amazing statement coming from a former Secretary of Defense. But I want to look at solutions here as we conclude. And you've talked about what it might look like for the U.S. nuclear arsenal to be downsized or even eliminated, or for disarmament to occur. Can you explain a little more of what that might look like and how that might be achieved?
Well, the proposal for a complete phase-out is being considered by disarmament groups all over the country. In particular, ICANN, as I mentioned earlier, is promoting a treaty ban at the United Nations that would forbid the production, development, deployment, possession, and use of nuclear weapons. In a treaty similar to the ban on landmines or the ban on cluster munitions, or the ban on chemical and biological weapons. So that's one proposal that's worth checking out. Monitored, verifiable reductions that have been going on for decades now. As I pointed out, the arsenal used to have over 25,000 warheads, and now it's down to 7,000. These reductions are verifiable and easily reached as long as the U.S. will lead the way. It seems to me it's quite easy to look. And the first chapter of our book does a pretty good analysis of the history of arms reductions, and it has been plodding slowly along in reducing the size of the arsenal. And this can be followed up on. It can be continued. But at the moment, focused attention mostly is on environmental issues and drone warfare and whatnot. And nuclear weapons have been pushed to the side as a sort of a threat. But thanks to William Perry and other activists who are drawing attention to the risks posed by the deployment of these weapons, it is being paid. And I believe the time is ripe for a real serious reduction and promotion of elimination of these things based on, in part, the statements of these highly authoritative experts.
Yeah, the time is right, and I want to thank you very much for joining me today to discuss this very important issue. If someone wants to learn more about nuclear weapons, the U.S. nuclear arsenal, the sorts of things we've been discussing today, what readings and resources do you recommend they take a look at, and what are the best ways to follow your work in particular?
Oh, thanks. People can check out our information at nukewatchinfo.org, and as far as other good background pieces, I would recommend Physicians for Social Responsibility, PSR.org. They did a recent report in the last 2 or 3 years about the consequences of limited nuclear war, and their report is called Nuclear Famine, and it has to do with the environmental consequences of dumping so much ash and soot into the air that would result from the mass fires that nuclear war would produce. And this cloud cover would then crash the agricultural capability of whole continents and produce famines worldwide, even a limited war involving only roughly 100 nuclear detonations. So that PSR.org has good background information. As I mentioned earlier, ICAN.org has great video information, short video documentaries about the weapons and about their campaign to see these weapons banned. For a purely scientific look at the environmental and health consequences of nuclear weapons production and deployment, the Institute for Environmental and Energy Research is an excellent source of scientific information. That's IEER.org.
All right, well, very good, and that's definitely a lot for people to check out. So I want to remind them that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/nuclear-arsenal, and the main reason to go to that website is because it's very hard, obviously, to remember all of those resources and websites that were just mentioned. But at wakeupcallpodcast.com/nuclear-arsenal, we'll have links to everything that was just mentioned, ICAN.org and PSR.org, and, of course, Nukewatchinfo.org, everything that has been mentioned over the course of this interview. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/nuclear-arsenal is the show notes page of this episode, and I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher, and to rate and review the show on iTunes, and also to sign up for our email list. That way you'll be able to keep up with all the episodes and keep up with what's going on with the show, and also help us out as well. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/nuclear-arsenal for today's show notes page, and subscribe to the show on your favorite podcatcher and sign up for our email list while you're at it. And John, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss this very important topic and to look at just exactly what we're talking about here and why it's so problematic and what can be done to eliminate this very dangerous, this very serious and potential danger that exists. So thank you so much for joining me today, and hopefully we can speak again sometime soon.
Oh, you're welcome, Adam. Thank you very much for having me on. I'd be glad to join you again sometime. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.